I recognize full well, in fact, I'm acutely aware that this is an event that's all about inspiration, it's about excitement, it's obviously about creativity we just saw, it's about mammoth bones turned into public art. I've spent my career inspired by the same things. Now I talk about insurance. But at first I'm going to step back and I'm going to talk about ACE, American Conservation Experience. They're here, they have a booth. It's an organization I founded. I was a trail runner. I just one day walked into a Forest Service office and said, how can I help the trails? Just want to volunteer. 23 years later, I'm still working with trails in a much different capacity. But I joined a conservation corps. That conservation corps was supposed to only work in a small county or a large county by size, small by population in Flagstaff, Arizona. But I took it to work in trails really throughout the Southwest. Eventually, I founded American Conservation Experience. When I left that organization, which did trails, we did fire prevention, which is a very timely topic, fuels reduction. When I left, we had 879 people in the field. I can tell you with quite honesty, from the time I discovered there was a cell phone and how it worked, I spent 20 years after that sleeping with a cell phone on and under my pillow. I know the feeling when the phone rings and the worst happens. I know when an eventual situation becomes an actual situation. Eventually someone's going to get hurt, someone actually does. I know the blood draining out of my legs and my arms, and then the relief surging back in when I discover that there hasn't been a fatality. There's an injury, but someone's going to recover. This was our map of our work when I left in the last full year by agency, 119 Park Service units alone. This was what changed my career, this picture, indirectly. This is Grand Canyon, Bright Angel Trail specifically. This one picture probably accounted for 200, maybe 500 people having an experience in ACE. They were so inspired by this vision of what you could experience. This picture also cost us our insurance. Insurance carriers, the companies that cover you and that have to pay when there's an accident or an injury, they're not inspired by the same things we are, typically. They are not even bemused by this picture. All they see is the potential for someone to step backwards and fall off the Grand Canyon. They saw this on our website. We were rightfully proud of it, and they cut our insurance, our workers' comp. At that point, I think I had 400 people in the field. Insurance is a strange beast. It's a strange choice. It's something, I hear it all the time, it's a necessary evil. I actually have people who now call me and ask for my help but say they hate insurance and they hate insurance brokers. There's a reason for that. But why did I choose it? Even though I had an organization I was very proud of, that I loved and still love, even though I had all the flexibility and all the joy of that work and working with youth and working in inspiring places, I chose insurance because ultimately what we do, what all of you do, is eventually going to get someone hurt. It's going to be simultaneously an exciting, encouraging, creative, visionary process, but also a dangerous process, or potentially dangerous. So you counter that two ways, and they're related. This is straining an analogy a little bit, but this is where my last project was that I led in the field. It's a confluence of the Green and the Colorado rivers. It's essentially the start of the Grand Canyon. It's a confluence, they call it. And I realized that insurance was the confluence of safety and liability. It's where they come together. And you can use liability, you can use the fear of loss, the cost of loss, as a catalyst, and that catalyst can inspire safety. And so I see an insurance brokerage as, first and foremost, a safety officer, a safety and compliance specialist working with organizations. I also, to strain the analogy again, realized there was a big chasm in understanding with organizations that work in the field on what their insurance is, what their insurance actually covers. This is not a political statement. It's maybe an opportunity or an effort to get a cheap laugh. I have the best words. We all know what that means. This, whoops, that wasn't meant to break open, is 5 pounds of paper, 500 sheets of paper. It is also exactly within 12 pages the number of pages that one of our clients' workers' comp policy is. I'll spare the mess with the second one because that is the general liability policy, which is essentially the same thing as War and Peace. It's slightly longer than the Mueller report. And so my question is, how many of you have actually read it? How many of you understand each of your policies? You don't, and that's why you hate insurance, because it's vulnerable to you. It's something that has huge consequences, but it's something that you don't understand and you don't trust, that even your broker understands. But I'll tell you who does understand it. It's the it's the carriers. All 500,000 words or whatever it is in a policy have been crafted ever so carefully, ever so meaningfully by legions, absolute teams of the highest paid lawyers that these companies can bring to bear. And they're not out there actually trying to screw you. They're trying to be very thorough, do their due diligence. They expect you to do the same, but how can you? So like anything else, whether it's problem solving in the last presentation, you take it in segments. You look at it to find a solution, you make it manageable, you compartmentalize. And so that's what I've tried to do, and I feel we are doing, trying to get a message out where we can compartmentalize really the biggest problems that trails organizations and maybe nonprofits as a whole face in the insurance industry or in their industries with regard to insurance. And so I'm just going to take the bull by the horns here. In the last 2 hours, I've probably had 15 people come up to me and say, I've got a trails organization. How on earth do I cover volunteers, or am I liable for an injury, or I work with the city, or I work with the municipality of some sort, or maybe a state. What if there's an injury? What if they injure someone else? It's a gigantic issue. It's the one thing, if I could solve for insurance nationwide and for our industry, it would be this. Of those hundreds of thousands of words, probably a third of them are exclusions. It tells you what insurance is covered or what activity is covered and what isn't. It either assigns or it excludes. And based on those words, you have coverage or you don't. One of the first things that most liability policies, almost everyone, excludes is volunteers. That means your volunteer goes out, let's say they're cutting a tree down. That tree is going to be used for a water bar, but instead it hits a passing cyclist. Who has coverage? If you're working on Forest Service land, Park Service land, probably the Forest Service or the Park Service if they signed you up as volunteers. If you're working on a land trust property, private land, municipal land, the odds are that the liability is with you. If you don't have the liability is with the individual, with the volunteer. I've had one person already in this conference come and tell me that they have a volunteer being sued because they injured someone on a project. This is a huge problem, and it's a problem that's not going to get better until someone really addresses it directly. I tell our staff always, don't bring us problems, bring us solutions. Volunteer exclusions for workers' comp are universal. a workers' comp policy is always going to say we're not going to cover volunteers. But there is something called a volunteer accident policy. Not to be confused, and I want to keep this as simple as possible, not to be confused with a accidental death and dismemberment policy. The name itself, when you hear accidental death and dismemberment, and that's the coverage, those are pretty extreme circumstances. What you really need, that's great. If someone loses a limb, you want there to be coverage, but you want that coverage to extend to accidents of all sorts, to medical, any sort of medical care that's required, and that's a big distinction. There are volunteer accident policies that do cover all volunteers. There are general liability. You can get general liability to extend to volunteers. You just have to read this mess of papers or have your broker understand it well enough to recommend that. One of the biggest problems I see industry-wide is the very bottom one. It's kind of the opposite of what we're talking about, and that is workers' comp. People think that if you get a volunteer accident policy, it can replace workers' comp. It can't. There are some distinctions, and they're important. Volunteer accident policy is limited. Maybe it's $100,000. Whatever you purchase, it's limited. By law, workers' compensation, the Federal Workers' Compensation Act, is unlimited. So when some people try and pay their participants, their volunteers in certain industries, a little bit less than minimum wage, it makes them volunteers technically, and then they put them on a volunteer accident policy. That's a huge mistake, because when there's an injury, there isn't legal coverage, unlimited coverage as is defined legally. AmeriCorps, I don't know how many of you work with AmeriCorps programs. I did my entire career. I started as an AmeriCorps member. AmeriCorps is its own limbo. AmeriCorps members are not employees. They're also not volunteers. By federal statute, the Corporation for National and Community Service defines what an AmeriCorps member is. It calls them a participant. That is a legal designation. They are a participant. Well, insurance companies have no understanding whatsoever for what a participant is. There's either an employee or a volunteer. AmeriCorps is neither of the above. This is, I'm very quickly going to tell you a story of what can go right with insurance. In this case, I had addressed with the insurance company, because I was a broker by this point, what AmeriCorps was, and I made sure that our paid AmeriCorps members would be covered under workers' comp. And then what could have been the worst, and in some ways was, but turned out with a happy ending, happened. The cliff on the left dislodged a rock by geologic process. It flew through the air, apparently made a whistling sound, and we had a crew member walking up the trail, just as she should. Everyone was in line as they should. There was no fault, nothing that anyone could have done to have prevented it. The picture on the right was indicative of how she was carrying their hard hats, as you're supposed to when you walk out of the Grand Canyon. The rock hit the back of the hard hat, ricocheted, hit her body, and by all rights, it's a miracle she survived. She not only survived, but after a relatively long hospitalization and recovery, she came back to the trail. But I met her mom at the emergency room, and I knew what was coming. I knew immediately grief would mingle, and it would mingle with anger. And her first question was, "You guys are responsible." And I was in a position to say, she's an AmeriCorps member, our workers' comp covers her. I could look her mom in the eye and tell her that. And indeed, she never had to worry about a lot. She had to worry about rehabilitation. She had to worry about her memories, etc. But she did not have to worry about her medical bills. They were all covered under workers' comp. So if you have AmeriCorps members, you need to make sure that they're covered one way or the other. The rest of this is much more simple, so I'm going to go a little bit faster through it. A lot of mountain biking organizations have general liability policies that exclude injuries from mountain bikes. Every almost every general liability coverage or policy excludes all special events that are not scheduled, which means if you don't tell your broker and your broker does not tell the insurance company about a special event, whether that's a luncheon, whether that's a volunteer recognition event, whether that's a race, you have no coverage. That's a gigantic issue. Fortunately, again, there are solutions. There are policies that mountain biking organizations can buy, and they're relatively cheap, that covers all of their exposure arising out of a mountain bike race. And that's huge. It boggles my mind that the industry isn't generally aware of that, and you see so many who are. This is an awkward picture. It's an awkward subject. I acknowledge that. The best advice I ever got when I was leading crews was from the foresters. They said, never go into a tent with anyone. And I've remembered that my whole career. And I extended it to never go anywhere alone in a remote setting. But almost every general liability policy that you first purchase, when they first offer it to you, to get the best rates, to win the account, it's going to exclude abuse and molestation. That's a gigantic problem. I keep saying that. It's so simple. It's also something that's very easy to add back in. You have to pay for it. You have to pay extra. But if you don't have that abuse and molestation coverage, I hate even saying the word, but I have to be blunt in this presentation, you're completely exposed. You're not only exposed if something actually happens, you have a duty to defend even if someone accuses someone in your organization of doing something inappropriate. You're going to have to defend it with legal fees. So no one in this industry should ever, in my opinion, have a policy that does not have abuse and molestation. Very quickly, I've talked a lot about nonprofits. The for-profit industry has a level of exposure too. Professional liability. If you build something and you have a credential, you design something and it fails, what happens? Someone could say that the design failure of your bridge or whatever you're building in this situation, a boardwalk, caused an injury, and you could be held responsible. Again, you can add this back in. Professional liability can be added. You just have to pay a little bit more or have a separate policy. The last one I'm really going to talk about is hired and non-owned auto. You see a lot of really small organizations, they say, well, I don't own a vehicle, so I don't need coverage. What if your volunteers are driving to one of your events? One of your staff members is driving a volunteer in their car to one of your volunteer projects, and you have an accident? If you don't have hired and non-owned auto, the odds are that's going to be declined. You're going to be in a lawsuit. I won't talk about a couple more of these. This is a joke. We actually had to pay $13,000 because we didn't have inland marine coverage. It's obviously not the end of the world if you don't. Several $100s of that was for underwear that one of our members said that he had bought 17 pairs or had 17 pairs and had lost them all. We paid $37 a pair. So with that, I will wrap up. And of course, there's a gratuitous picture of my dog because I don't ever talk to people without mentioning my dog. Thank you.